All right, this presentation is from a PowerPoint on basically composition and what I like to call ways of seeing in photography. So this is for Art 205. It's part of your homework, and we're going to talk about these concepts in class. And we want to move on beyond just having accurate exposures and then really kind of thinking about what makes an image interesting and how to make it visually exciting. And this is kind of some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here. So we'll just kind of do this basic question. What makes a good photograph? So overall, probably more important than apertures and shutter speeds and composition and everything else is just this idea of having a strong subject and or idea that can impact. So you have impact that can be the subject, the mood, and or design. Photographic composition, use a focal point. Try not to have distractions. Also think about be aware of composition and subject placement. Light and tonal awareness. So these kind of are kind of our 2D design fundamentals. Play with light and shadow. Decide what is illuminated, what isn't. Use tonal contrast to create visual emphasis. And also color awareness when working in color. So color schemes can create harmony, contrast, mood, and visual emphasis. So let's begin. So what is composition? I love this quote, people not cameras compose photographs. So think about how when you look through the viewfinder, you look on the back of your camera and what you're seeing and how you're arranging those objects in space. So composition is the careful and deliberate arrangement of objects and visual elements within the frame. Composition helps to direct the viewer's eye as it flows from object to object within the scene. Think and see before you press the shutter release. Little button on the camera. So here are some basic guidelines for photographic composition. Visual emphasis, or our focal point. It's the idea of simplicity. Rule of thirds, use of lines, direction of movement, the frame and framing the subject, vantage point or point of view, space and depth, figure-ground relationship, avoiding mergers. So we're going to break these all down. Let's start off with focal point, or our visual emphasis. A focal point attracts the eye to a visual climax, stressing a key point. Without it, the eye wanders. So where is your eye drawn to in the frame? Where is it kind of taken to? What is it that basically stands out? Simplicity. So strong compositions without distractions will allow your viewer to better understand the purpose and message of your image. Here's kind of an example. So the camera is basically in the same general area in these two photos. So on the left, there's a family reunion, and here's mom and child, but there's a lot of distractions. There's a lot of things in the background here, other people, other things coming on. We can see her knee brace going on, all sorts of interesting stuff. Whereas on the right, you know, what was this image really about? Well, it's really about the relationship between mom and child and maybe how much we're drawn to the child itself. So if you look at the one on the right, it really just kind of takes us in and just thinks about that part. So what's the most interesting part of the scene and keeping it simple? And we can do that by how we frame the subject, how close we get, our depth of field choices, all sorts of things. The rule of thirds. This is a classic compositional rule in any kind of 2D form, printmaking, painting, drawing. And the general idea is if you take your rectangle and you divide it by 3 across and 3 down, these little meeting points are kind of where our eye is drawn to, and they're off center. So we kind of like things to be sort of off center, not bullseye effect. And these little meeting points are a great little place to create tension and push us around in the frame. It also is great for working with diagonals and intersecting lines. So here's kind of a good example in this portrait of Philip Glass working on the piano. And you can kind of see that where the red circle is, that's where the Philip's face is, and that kind of falls in rule of thirds. But if you also look, there's a diagonal between his face and his hands. His hands kind of flow to the second rule of thirds connection point down there in the opposite diagonal. Leading lines. Here's some ideas where how lines can help. So when we talk about lines, you have leading lines. They can take you from the frame to the focal point. They can direct the viewer to the subject. Diagonal lines, the basic rule here is diagonals are dynamic. So they move the viewer's eye around the frame. S-curve. moves the eye from one side to the other and back again, and implied lines are formed from multiple objects in a path or sequence. So here's an example, and you kind of have to realize these lines are not necessarily going to be obvious, but they're kind of made up by things in the frame. So leading lines and converging lines. So if we look at this woman here with the fabric, if you look at the way a bunch of folds in the fabric, the lines and the creases and stuff, they're kind of coming towards her body, and the way the arms kind of lead up to her head, and then the way that some of the reeds sort of tip towards her as well. So they're leading and converging to a more central point, more or less. Diagonal lines. So without the light rays, this image would be rather static. Diagonal lines make it more dynamic. So just even the rays of light, they don't have to be a physical object, can really start to play around. And there's kind of an X that's forming between a shadow and a ray of light here in front of this man. Here's a great example of diagonal lines created by the body. Here we have the pitcher wound up, ready to pitch the ball, and you can see the tension going from that leg up to the pitcher's head area, and then going back down to the arm. And we have this kind of nice, like, two parts of a triangle being drawn together. Implied line. So with implied lines, sometimes multiple objects in a scene will kind of come together and give you the sense of a line, such as these pillars going back into space. Use of lines. So here's a great example, this Danny Lyons photograph here, and how lines are kind of coming together. So if you look at the barbed wire fence, and you look at the groups of prisoners here, you can kind of see these different lines coming towards the guard who's on horseback there, and he's backlit and looking down at everybody else. And so these lines kind of draw you up to that point. And not only is it a visual emphasis, but you can kind of get the feeling of this authoritarian figure looking down over these prisoners at the same time. So there's maybe some content to be derived out of this as well. The S-curve, very common in landscape photography, any place where you have streams, sidewalks, paths, roads, trails, anything like that, you can get the S-curve idea. So here we have this nice, beautiful stream cutting through, and if you look at it kind of with a compositional guide, you can kind of see how the stream goes left and then right and left again, moving you throughout the frame. The frame itself and framing the subject. So we're thinking about when you look through the viewfinder or the back of the camera, and it says you decide what to include and what to leave out. Our minds make connections to the scene beyond the frame. So even though I don't see everything because of this tight crop, I get a sense of the second person. So we have this one child holding the arm of what appears to probably be an adult just because of the size difference there. And so we get kind of a relationship even though we don't know exactly who that person is. And we're kind of connected to parts of the scene beyond what is actually in the frame. Another way to think about frames is putting subjects within containment in the image. So here, this boar or beetle within the kind of confines of the ear. So frames within the image. Some frames are kind of natural via the shape of things. So here, this window makes a perfect frame for the mom and child here in the Steve McCurry photograph. So frames within the image. The frame can also provide context because we get the feeling of being a person inside this car looking at what's happening outside the car and that connection. Another version, the frame filling the frame with a tight crop. So try to have your subject touch or come close to touching at least 3 sides. And by doing so, what it does is it kind of really fills the frame. You really get a sense that you're up close to the subject. Here's even a tighter crop filling the frame, touching all 4 sides. It can be kind of interesting, a little different. Another element to think about is direction and movement. So the way objects appear in the frame and how they're moving gives you a sense of what's going on. So here we have the 2 people snowshoeing up the hill, and the implication here is the person that's closest to us is moving up and left. And we get that sense there partly because of the hill, but also when the person is in the lower part and also on the right of the photograph, it gives them space to go up and left. So we naturally follow this diagonal to go up and left, and then we get the sense that the person whose back is towards us is moving away from us. Another one of these elements is vantage point. So proximity to subject. As a viewer, do you see the whole scene or part of it? Are you within the action? Another thing to think of this is point of view. So bird's eye view, looking down from above, worm's eye view, looking up from below. Or having a slight angle or perspective changes can make a big impact on composition. So tweaking the way you're standing in front of the subject can be a big difference. So here's a couple extremes. So on the raven here, we're very close up to the beak, and that's a really close up point of view, versus the Andreas Gursky photo here of the big pool scene. We're very far away, taking in a vast amount of space, an aerial view. So being eye level with the subject can make a big difference. So kind of, one thing I always tell parents is get down on the ground at the eye level of your kids when you photograph them, and you'll probably really like those portraits of your kids. When you're always photographing from above, you're getting these kind of weird angles looking at the top of their heads. So being able to change your point of view really helps to get to where our subject is, and gives a different context from the point of view of that subject sometimes as well. Personal photograph from a little while back of mine. One thing I strive for in my own work is playing around with points of view and trying to get kind of sense of being up in the air and above when I'm playing around, especially in these kite scenes. You can also get interesting context from being below. So, the top one is a photograph I took while being inside a crevasse on Mount Rainier, looking out of the crevasse, which is a very different feeling than being up on top of the glacier. Or unique ways, in this case, to photograph this palm tree here from below, looking up into the palms. Thinking about what point of view is best to show action. So here, being at eye level with the bull and having the bull still down, the carrot would be very different than if you were eye level with the matador. So it's really interesting where you choose and what kind of action you're going to get from an active scene. Space and depth, and this really plays with horizon lines. So depending on how you have this horizon line really changes the way that we think about space. So in this case, when the subject is high in the background, it creates depth leading towards the focal point. So in other words, there's a lot of water between us and this person by having that horizon line up high, and it really gives us a sense of going back into space. So here we have the subject low in the foreground, and it creates depth beyond the subject, so going into the distance. When we stagger objects in the scene, you have kind of a foreground object, a middle ground, a background going back, and that's another way to create space. Another way to think about space and depth are figure-ground relationships, and that really kind of is sort of what we talk about as positive and negative space in art. So if we kind of think about this, when you have empty areas, in this case the sky, they sort of frame the objects that are contained within those empty areas, in this case the trees, and it makes the trees feel more forward to us. Another way to play with this is with depth of field, and that's kind of unique to photography. So by having blurred backgrounds, the object that is in focus really kind of comes forward towards us. We talk about balance in different ways in photography. So here are different ideas of balance. So symmetrical balance, both sides are equal. Asymmetrical, you have uneven sides. You can have asymmetrical group where they aren't identical, but they take up about the same amount of space on both sides. Off-center asymmetrical, where it's not quite bullseye, it's a little off to one side. Radial, often symmetrical, so things that radiate from the center can get a certain type of balance as well. So balance is the visual weight of objects within a composition. Here are some examples of symmetrical balance. So we have two kids that take up about the same amount of space, one on the left, one on the right. So that is fairly symmetrically balanced. And then the scene here of this building with Andreas Gursky, it is almost just like a mirror image. It is so similar between the left and right that it's very well split down the center, very well balanced. Here is an asymmetrical balance, and it can create visual tension. This can be engaging to the viewer. So we have kind of the backlit photo or portrait of the man with the cross here in the sort of bottom third, bottom left third, and being balanced by the man over on the top right. Radial balance. So here the hair coming from the scalp, or often found in nature with flowers and various plants, things coming from a central point and going outwards. So a couple things we want to avoid that deal with frames and balance are avoiding mergers. So in this case here, these hands are merging into the frame on the left. A better way to do this photograph would be to pull back a little bit and get the tips of the fingers. In general, we want to be aware of where your subject is and the frame. Avoid cropping a person at joints, hands, and feet. Here's another example, two views of the same event. So on the one on the left, this kid happens to be standing in front of a telephone pole, and the telephone pole looks like it's coming out of his head. So you want to just be aware of things like this. Be aware of your subject and their surroundings. Avoid objects merging with the subject. In this case, a vertical orientation worked better to capture the subject. So also kind of just moving a little bit to the side. The telephone pole isn't an issue anymore, and you don't have any weird things poking into the kid's head. But having said all this, sometimes breaking any of the guidelines presented in this presentation can be fun and exciting and creative. So breaking the rules can lead to interesting images as well, such as this merger right here.